HOA threw a celebration on my private lake, while I was told I didn't belong on my own land. I stepped out to find my private lake turned into an HOA celebration site, with barricades, banners, and strangers acting like they owned it. No one asked permission. I didn't stop it, because I already knew something wasn't right. If you like real land stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The first thing I saw when I stepped out of my house that morning was a security line stretched across my own shoreline. Not a suggestion, not a warning, an actual barrier. 2 folding barricades, bright tape, and a young man in an event vest standing in the middle of my gravel driveway like he had authority over it. Robert Hayes paused mid-step, feeling the gravel shift under his boots the same way it had for decades. The land didn't feel different. The people on it did. Behind the barricade, he could hear something completely out of place. Music from portable speakers, a microphone testing feedback, and the low rising hum of a crowd gathering near the water. The young man raised a hand without hesitation. "Sir, this is a restricted area. VIP access only. You need to step back." Robert looked at him for a long second. The kid couldn't have been more than 24. Clean vest, rented radio clipped to his shoulder, the posture of someone repeating instructions he didn't understand. Robert's eyes moved past him, toward the shoreline. That's where the problem really was. There were decorations, not small ones, full event infrastructure. A white arch had been installed at the entry path leading down to the dock. Plastic signage staked into the ground. Folding chairs already lined up facing the water. And beyond it all, his lake, his family's lake, was being prepared like it belonged to someone else. "I think there's been a mistake," Robert said calmly. The young man didn't move. "No mistake, sir. HOA event. Private authorization. You'll need to return to your residence." Robert exhaled slowly through his nose. The gravel crunch under passing footsteps made him turn his head slightly. More people were arriving. Neighbor he recognized. Some carrying drinks, some with phones already raised, like they were walking into something official. No one looked confused. That was the part that didn't sit right. A banner fluttered near the dock. He could see part of it now between moving bodies. Lakeside Community Celebration Event. His name wasn't on anything. Not the signs, not the flyers being handed out, not the loudspeaker announcement echoing faintly across the water. Robert stepped forward anyway. The young man shifted instantly to block him again. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stay behind the designated line." Robert stopped just short of him, close enough now to see the cheap stitching on the vest, the rented name tag that read "Event Staff." "Who gave you permission to set foot on this property?" Robert asked. The question landed, but there was no answer. The young man adjusted his stance instead, gripping the radio like it might respond for him. Behind them, the sound of the crowd grew louder. A microphone squealed once, then settled. Someone tested the speaker again. Laughter carried across the shoreline like it belonged there. Robert's gaze moved slowly across the setup again. The dock he had rebuilt 5 years ago, after a storm, was now dressed with temporary railings. His shoreline, which had been quiet at dawn, was already changing shape under boots and banners. The young man finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to call the sheriff for trespassing." For a moment, Robert didn't respond. The word didn't even register at first. Trespassing. On land his father had registered in the county books before this kid was born. He looked past the barricade again. The crowd was thickening now. Families, neighbors, a few unfamiliar faces in matching shirts, and at the center of it all, the dock, turned into a stage without permission, without notice, without even acknowledgement that anyone else might have a claim here. Robert finally spoke, voice steady but low. "Tell me something," he said. "If this is a community event," he paused, letting the words settle. "Why does it look like I'm the only one not invited to my own lake?" The young man didn't answer. But someone else was walking up behind the barricade now. Someone who hadn't been there a moment ago. And Robert already knew, before turning his head, that this wasn't going to stay a misunderstanding for very long. Because whatever was happening down by that water was already being treated as settled. Even if it had never been discussed with him at all. Robert Hayes stepped past the young event staff member without touching him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply kept walking toward the shoreline, and the hesitation that followed behind him was the first crack in the control they thought they had. The barricade line didn't stop him. It shifted slightly as people noticed him moving through it. Conversations near the dock slowed, then paused entirely. A few heads turned. Not because he was loud, but because he didn't behave like someone who had accepted being excluded from his own land. That's when he saw her. Melissa Carter stood near the dock steps, holding a tablet in one hand and a microphone in the other, as if both belonged to her equally. She was surrounded by branded signage, folding tables, and printed banners that turned the shoreline into something resembling a staged civic event. She smiled when she saw him approach. Not surprised, prepared. "Robert," she said into the mic, loud enough for the nearest rows of people to hear. "I was hoping you'd come out here so we could clear this up publicly." That sentence changed the air immediately. Heads turned fully now. Phones lifted. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were participating. Robert stopped a few feet from the dock edge. "Clear what up?" Melissa tapped her tablet and gestured behind her. "Today marks the official Lakeside Community Stewardship Celebration. As per HOA Amendment Authorization, this waterway is now designated for shared community access." There was a pause after she said it, as if she expected applause. A few people clapped uncertainly. Others simply nodded, already accepting it as fact, because it had been said with confidence and a microphone. Robert looked past her toward the water. The dock was dressed in banners. A temporary stage had been assembled near the center platform. Even the shoreline markers had been replaced with printed signs bearing HOA branding. Every piece of it was wrong, and every piece of it was intentional. "There is no authorization," Robert said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That lake is deeded private property. It has been for generations. Melissa tilted her head slightly, like he had said something outdated. "We've already reviewed historical use patterns and municipal zoning allowances. This area has functioned as a shared recreational space informally for years." Robert finally looked at her directly. Informally doesn't override a deed. That was the first real silence. Not confusion, not noise. Silence that meant people were deciding which version of reality to accept. Melissa stepped closer to the mic again. "We understand your emotional attachment to the property, but the HOA has a responsibility to ensure community access and equitable use of natural resources." Equitable use. The phrase landed carefully in the crowd. It sounded official enough to replace truth if no one checked it. Robert noticed something then. The crowd wasn't resisting her. They were waiting to see if he would. Evan Carter moved in closer behind Melissa, scanning the perimeter like security. He wasn't watching Robert. He was watching the crowd, making sure the narrative stayed intact. Robert pointed toward the dock. That structure was not approved. That banner was not approved. None of this was approved. Melissa didn't flinch. "The HOA board has documentation." "Then show it," Robert said immediately. That was the first time her expression tightened. Just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who understood paperwork to recognize hesitation. She tapped her tablet again, faster this time. "We're not here to litigate. We're here to celebrate what belongs to the community." Robert took one step closer now, just enough to make the space between them uncomfortable. "Then you won't mind showing it to a county official," he said. A ripple moved through the crowd at that, not panic, not agreement, something closer to recalibration. Melissa held her smile, but her grip on the tablet shifted. We've complied with all HOA procedural requirements. Robert didn't respond immediately. He looked at the banners again. Then the dock, then the shoreline, where temporary posts had been driven into ground that had never been surveyed for public use. And for the first time, he understood what this was really built on. Not law, not ownership, presentation. You didn't just set up an event, he said quietly. You set up a story. Melissa leaned into the microphone slightly. This community deserves shared access to its resources. Robert nodded once, slowly. Then we'll let the county decide what this lake is. That was the moment Evan stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to intervene. But he stopped when Robert reached into his jacket, not aggressively, not dramatically, and pulled out his phone. He didn't show it yet. He just held it. And for the first time since Robert arrived, Melissa didn't speak immediately. It was because something about the way he stood there suggested this wasn't a protest. It was documentation. Robert Hayes kept his phone in his hand, but didn't raise it yet. That alone changed the energy around him. People noticed when someone wasn't reacting emotionally. It meant they were preparing something else, something slower, something deliberate. Melissa Carter watched him carefully now, her confidence tightening instead of expanding. She stepped closer to the microphone again, forcing the moment back into public control. We appreciate your concerns, Robert, she said, voice smooth, practiced. But this event is already underway and fully authorized under HOA governance. Robert finally lifted his phone, but not toward her. He turned it slightly, capturing the dock, the banners, the crowd, and the temporary structures that had been built into his shoreline. No commentary, no confrontation, just recording. That quiet act shifted the room more than any argument could have. A few neighbors looked uncertain now. Not enough to speak, but enough to hesitate. That hesitation was dangerous for Melissa. It meant the story was no longer unanimous. Evan Carter stepped forward slightly. Sir, you're not permitted to record staff during HOA proceedings. Robert glanced at him. This is my property. Evan didn't respond immediately. The phrase didn't carry the same weight it had an hour ago. It was starting to compete with the crowd narrative instead of automatically overriding it. Melissa interrupted before silence could spread. Let's stay focused. This is about community access and shared benefit. But the crowd wasn't fully with her anymore. Small fractures were forming. A man near the dock lowered his drink. A woman behind him whispered something to her husband. A teenager checked her phone again, not for photos but for clarity. Robert noticed it. He didn't push it. He let it happen naturally. Because truth didn't need force when doubt had already started working. Melissa adjusted her tone. We've maintained open recreational access here for years. This lake has served families across this community long before formal designation. Robert spoke quietly, cutting through the performance without raising his voice. That lake has never been open access. It has always been deeded private land. The word deeded landed differently. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't interpretive. It was structural. A man near the back of the crowd called out, unsure. Is that true? Melissa turned immediately toward the sound. We have HOA records confirming shared usage agreements. Robert finally raised his phone slightly higher, not at her, but at the banners again. Then show them. The crowd shifted again. Now they were watching Melissa more than the lake. That was the first real loss of control. Not legal, social. Evan leaned toward her, speaking low. We might need to slow this down. Melissa didn't answer him. Instead, she stepped off the dock and moved closer to Robert, lowering her voice, but keeping it audible enough for nearby listeners. This doesn't have to escalate, she said. We can acknowledge your concerns privately after the event. Robert looked at her for a moment. Not angry, not impressed, just assessing. Then he said, You didn't ask me before you built on my land. That sentence did something the previous ones didn't. It removed interpretation. A woman in the crowd asked louder now, "Wait, he owns it?" Melissa turned fast. "We are not disputing ownership. We are discussing community access rights." But the shift had already started. Once ownership entered the conversation, everything else became secondary. Robert took one step forward now, finally closing distance with the dock. The event staff didn't stop him this time. That was new. He looked at the temporary signage near the water, then at the printed HOA emblem on the banner, then at Melissa. "You built a public narrative on private land," he said, "and you didn't verify the foundation." Melissa's expression tightened for the first time into something less controlled. "We followed HOA protocol." Robert nodded slightly. "Then you should have no problem proving it." He lifted his phone fully now, but instead of recording, he turned the screen toward her, not the camera. The document view, a scanned deed summary, county header, parcel outline, historical ownership chain. Melissa's eyes flicked down just once, and in that single glance, something in her confidence faltered. Not fully broken, but no longer absolute. Behind them, the crowd was no longer fully watching the lake. They were watching the exchange, waiting for which version of reality would hold. Robert didn't move closer. He didn't need to, because now the question had changed. Not, "What is this event?" but "Who is actually allowed to stand on this land?" The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. No one answered it immediately. And that silence did something subtle but powerful. It forced the crowd to look for proof instead of emotion. Melissa Carter stepped in quickly, breaking that shift before it could settle. She raised her tablet again, this time signaling to someone near the dock. "We anticipated this concern," she said smoothly, "which is why we have full HOA documentation available for public review." Evan Carter moved forward with a black folder in hand, not rushed, controlled. He handed it to Melissa like it had already been validated somewhere else. Melissa held it up for the crowd first, not for Robert. "This is Amendment 14, filed and ratified under Lakeside Estates Governance Authority." The word ratified carried weight in the crowd. People shifted slightly, as if that single term had legal gravity on its own. Robert didn't touch the document yet. He watched her instead. The way she presented it mattered more than what it said. Confidence without hesitation usually meant people assumed it had already been checked. Melissa opened the folder and turned the first page outward. Laminated, clean, official-looking seals printed in color. HOA letterhead at the top. This amendment formally designates the lake and surrounding shoreline as a shared community recreational asset under HOA stewardship, she announced. A few people nodded immediately, not because they understood it, but because it sounded structured, final. Robert stepped closer. "That is not a legal instrument," he said quietly. Melissa didn't look at him yet. "It is a governing amendment approved by the board." "That doesn't make it a property transfer," Robert replied. That was the first crack. Not visible to everyone, but enough for those paying attention. A few heads turned back toward him instead of her. Melissa finally faced him fully. "The HOA has authority over community use, designation, and shared resource management within jurisdictional boundaries." Robert nodded once. "Show me the recorded county filing." The phrase hit harder than expected, because it changed the conversation from internal governance to external law. For the first time, Evan hesitated before speaking. He looked at Melissa, not the crowd. Melissa didn't answer the question. Instead, she amplified her tone slightly for the audience. "This amendment has been in effect since board approval and has guided community access policy without issue." Robert opened the folder himself now. He didn't take it from her. He simply turned the edge enough to see inside. His eyes scanned quickly, not emotionally, structurally. Then he stopped. "There's no county stamp on this," he said. Melissa smiled lightly, as if that detail didn't matter. HOA governance does not always require external filing for community operational amendments. Robert closed the folder gently. That sound carried more weight than expected. That's not how property works, he said. The crowd reacted differently now, not unified, split. Some still followed Melissa's confidence. Others were beginning to track Robert's consistency. A man near the back raised his phone slightly, not recording yet, just checking something. A woman beside him whispered, "Shouldn't this be on county records?" That question spread quietly through nearby listeners like a slow leak. Melissa noticed it immediately. Her control depended on momentum, and momentum was starting to hesitate. Evan stepped forward, lowering his toward Robert. "Sir, this is an internal HOA matter. It doesn't require escalation." Robert turned slightly toward him. "You brought barricades onto private property and staged a public event," he said. "That's escalation." Evan didn't respond. Melissa quickly regained control of the microphone. "We are not here to debate technicalities. We are here to celebrate community access that has existed in practice for years." Robert looked back at the document one more time. Then he said something quieter. "Practice doesn't override ownership." That line landed differently. It didn't argue. It defined. For the first time, Melissa looked at the crowd instead of controlling them. She was checking whether they still followed her version of the story. And that was when she noticed something new. They weren't fully unified anymore. They were waiting. Not for celebration, for confirmation. Robert Hayes didn't move when the crowd shifted again. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't try to reclaim space that was already being mentally reassigned by everyone watching. Instead, he simply stopped speaking. That change was immediate and noticeable. Melissa Carter expected resistance, words, objections, confrontation. Silence was harder to control. Silence left room for doubt. Robert turned away from the dock and walked a few steps back toward the gravel path. Not retreating, positioning. The crowd tracked him without realizing it. When a man stops fighting a narrative and starts observing it, people instinctively become uneasy. Melissa followed his movement with her eyes. "Mr. Hayes," she said into the microphone, forcing authority back into the space. "This event is proceeding under HOA governance and will continue as scheduled." Robert didn't respond. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers. Not dramatic, not displayed, just held. A few nearby neighbors noticed. One leaned forward slightly. Another stopped recording long enough to focus. Melissa noticed that shift too. Evan stepped closer to her side. "We should redirect this," he muttered. But Melissa was already committed to the stage she had built. "We have already established jurisdiction through community governance protocols," she said louder. "This is not a contested matter." Robert unfolded the first page halfway, not showing it yet. Just enough for the edge of a county seal to become visible. That detail changed the temperature of the crowd. Seals carry authority even when unread. A man near the front asked quietly, "Is that from the county?" Melissa responded quickly. "The HOA has filed all necessary internal compliance documentation." Robert finally spoke, but not to her. Internal documents don't override recorded deed ownership. The word deed pulled attention harder than anything else so far. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't interpretive. It was structural reality. Melissa tightened her grip on the microphone. "We are not disputing private property boundaries. We are discussing shared usage designation under long-standing community practice." Robert looked up at her for the first time in a while. "Then show me where that designation was recorded outside your board." A pause followed, not long, but long enough, because everyone understood the difference now. One system was speaking in internal language. The other required external validation. Melissa shifted slightly. HOA amendments govern community infrastructure decisions. Robert nodded once. Not land ownership. That line didn't escalate. It clarified. And clarity is harder to defend against than argument. A few people in the crowd began looking at each other instead of the stage. Phones came down. Conversations started quietly in fragments. Shouldn't this be filed with the county? Isn't there a deed involved? Why would they build all this without ownership confirmation? The questions didn't need answers yet. They just needed space. Melissa felt it immediately. Control wasn't breaking. It was dispersing. She stepped forward slightly, voice sharper now. This is a matter of community stewardship and collective benefit. We are not revisiting foundational ownership structures during an active public event. Robert raised the papers slightly higher, not presenting them yet, but no longer hiding them. Then why does your amendment reference land boundaries it can't legally define? That question hit differently. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. Evan looked at Melissa again, this time more urgently. We need documentation verification, he said quietly. Melissa didn't answer him. She was watching Robert now as if recalculating the situation in real time. Because something had changed, he wasn't reacting to them anymore. He was preparing something they hadn't seen yet. Robert Hayes stood still for a moment, letting the noise of the crowd settle into the background instead of the foreground. The HOA speakers still carried Melissa Carter's voice across the shoreline, but it no longer anchored the moment. Something else had taken over, attention shifting away from performance and towards structure. He opened the folder fully now, not dramatically, just enough for those closest to him to see official formatting, county headers, stamped pages, and survey lines drawn with precision instead of interpretation. Melissa noticed immediately. Mr. Hayes, she said sharply into the microphone. This is not the appropriate forum for presenting disputed private documentation. Robert didn't look at her. He turned slightly toward the nearest group of neighbors instead. Has anyone here seen the county deed records for this property? No one answered immediately. That hesitation mattered more than agreement. It meant they were now considering verification instead of narrative. Evan stepped forward half a step. Sir, HOA governance documents are sufficient for community designation purposes. Robert finally looked at him. Not for land ownership. That sentence cut cleanly through the space. Not loud. Not emotional. Just final. A woman near the dock lowered her phone and whispered, "What does he mean? Ownership?" Melissa raised her voice immediately to regain control. This lake has been maintained as a shared community resource under HOA stewardship for years. Robert flipped one page forward in the folder and held it slightly higher, not for Melissa, but for everyone behind her. A certified deed outline, parcel boundaries marked in survey-grade precision. This, he said calmly, is recorded at the county level, not the HOA level. That detail changed the weight of the moment again. Not instantly, but structurally. People stopped looking at Melissa when she spoke. They started looking at the documents when Robert moved them. Melissa tightened her grip on the microphone. HOA governance does not require repeated external validation once community standards are established. Robert nodded slightly. That only applies if you actually have authority over the land. A silence followed that was different from before. This one wasn't emotional. It was procedural. People were trying to decide which system they were standing inside of. Evan leaned toward Melissa again, more urgent now. We need to verify county filings, he said under his breath. Melissa ignored him and addressed the crowd instead. We are not revisiting foundational ownership claims during an ongoing public event. This has already been established within the community framework. Robert turned slightly, just enough to face the crowd again. You were given a narrative, he said, not a title. That distinction landed harder than anything else so far. A man near the back spoke up cautiously. Is there a county record for this? Melissa answered immediately. All required HOA documentation has been properly filed internally. Robert didn't respond to her this time. Instead, he placed one document on the hood of a nearby table, slowly, deliberately. The sound of paper touching plastic cut through the ambient noise. A stamped county survey. The first few people closest leaned in, not because they were told to, but because they were no longer sure what they had been standing on. Melissa noticed the shift and stepped forward off the dock, slightly, closing distance. If you have external documentation, it should have been submitted through proper channels before this event, she said. Robert looked at her directly now. It was. That was the first time she hesitated without immediately filling the space. A faint ripple moved through the crowd. Questions no longer needed permission to exist. What channels? Someone asked. Melissa didn't answer that. Instead, she tried to redirect. We are discussing community access rights, not individual property disputes. Robert lifted another page. You can't grant access to something you don't own. The sentence wasn't aggressive, it was definitional, and definitions were harder to defend against than arguments. Evan stepped back slightly now, scanning the crowd instead of the stage. The confidence structure was no longer stable. Melissa looked at Robert again, but this time her expression had changed. Less control, more calculation. Because now the question wasn't whether he had documents. It was whether the system she built could survive them being read out loud. Robert Hayes didn't move immediately after placing the deed records on the table. He let them sit there full view of the crowd, not as an argument, but as a reference point. Something measurable. Something that didn't change depending on who was speaking. Melissa Carter noticed the shift instantly, not in the crowd's volume, but in their attention. People were no longer reacting to her voice. They were comparing it to something else. That was the moment she understood. The risk wasn't disagreement. It was verification. Mr. Hayes, she said into the microphone. Sharper now. We are not conducting a legal proceeding here. Robert finally looked at her. You already did, he replied. A murmur ran through the dockside crowd. Not loud, controlled. The kind of sound people make when they realize they might be standing on unstable ground. Evan stepped closer to Melissa. We need to pause this, he said under his breath. But Melissa shook her head once. We are proceeding under HOA authority. Robert opened another document in the folder. This one had a county engineering header. Not HOA, not internal, external, certified. He didn't explain it. He simply set it down beside the first. A few people leaned forward again. The pattern was becoming obvious now. Every document he placed added weight. Every HA statement began to float slightly above reality instead of anchoring it. Melissa tried to regain control. The HOA has maintained operational stewardship of this shoreline through continuous community use designation. Robert nodded slightly. Then you should have no issue with a county water authority verification. That sentence changed Melissa's posture. Subtly. Not visibly to most, but enough for Evan to notice immediately. What verification? Someone in the crowd asked. Robert didn't answer them directly. Instead, he looked toward the shoreline, past the dock, past the banners, toward the water itself, or where the water used to sit fully, because something was changing. The edge of the lake looked different now, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The shoreline markers installed for the event no longer aligned with the actual water level. A visible drop had begun. People noticed it at different speeds. First confusion, then pointing, then silence. A woman near the front said it out loud. Is the water lower? Melissa turned sharply toward the dock edge. That was the first time her control slipped from language into observation. Robert didn't look surprised. He simply watched. Evan stepped forward toward the shoreline, scanning it. That wasn't part of the plan, he said quietly. Melissa snapped back. What do you mean? But Evan didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't procedural. It was physical. The water line had dropped again, slightly more, enough to expose a thin strip of previously submerged bank. enough to make the temporary dock pilings look misaligned with the ground they were anchored in. The crowd began to shift away from celebration entirely. Phones weren't recording speeches anymore. They were pointing at the shoreline. Robert finally spoke again, calm and steady. That's what happens when water rights are executed under county authorization. Melissa turned back to him immediately. What did you do? For the first time, her voice wasn't controlling the moment. It was reacting to it. Robert didn't answer directly. He tapped the engineering document once with his finger. I followed the legal process. The phrase landed heavier than anything else so far, because it implied structure, not interference, authority, not disruption. A man near the back muttered, "County authorization." Another voice followed, "Is that why the water's dropping?" Melissa stepped toward Robert now, lowering her voice into something sharper. You don't have authority to manipulate community infrastructure during an HOA event. Robert looked at her directly. It's not community infrastructure. That sentence broke something in the pacing of the crowd. Not loudly, quietly, but decisively. Because now they were no longer just watching a disagreement. They were watching two systems define the same object differently, and only one of those systems had paperwork attached to it. Evan looked toward Melissa again. This time his voice was urgent. We need legal clarification now. Melissa didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were still on the shoreline, watching the water drop in a way that wasn't dramatic, but irreversible in perception. The event wasn't collapsing yet, but it was no longer stable. Robert Hayes stood near the edge of the gathering, not moving toward the dock this time. He didn't need to. The center of gravity had already begun shifting away from Melissa Carter and toward the shoreline itself. Because the shoreline was changing, it started subtly. Too subtle for certainty, but too visible to ignore. The waterline that had framed the community celebration now sat lower against the exposed bank. The temporary dock supports looked slightly misaligned, as if the ground beneath them had moved without permission. A few people noticed first, then more. Then it became impossible not to see. That wasn't there earlier, someone said near the front row. Melissa heard it. She stepped forward immediately, raising the microphone again. There is no cause for concern, she said firmly. This is part of scheduled maintenance adjustments to improve shoreline access conditions. But the explanation didn't land the way it used to, because people could see the water, and water didn't care about explanations. Evan Carter moved quickly toward the dock edge, scanning the structural points. His expression shifted from controlled to uncertain. This isn't staging, he muttered. The level is actually dropping. Melissa turned sharply. That's not possible. Robert finally spoke from where he stood. It is when the county executes a controlled adjustment under water rights authority. The phrase again. Water rights, authority, controlled. It wasn't emotional language, it was structural language, and it carried more weight in silence than Melissa's microphone carried in volume. A woman in the crowd stepped back from the dock edge. "Is the lake draining?" she asked out loud. No one answered her, because no one in charge had a version of events that matched what their eyes were seeing. Melissa walked closer to Robert now, lowering her voice. You cannot execute anything on shared community property without coordination. Robert met her gaze. It's not shared community property. That line didn't escalate. It clarified again. And clarity was becoming dangerous for her position. Evan looked between them now, visibly unsettled. We need county confirmation on what's happening, he said quickly. Melissa snapped back. There is no county action authorized here. Robert reached into his folder again and pulled out a single sheet, different from the others. This one was simpler, less decorative, more final. He placed it on the nearest table, flat and visible. A permit authorization, county header, water management division, signature line, time-stamped. A few people leaned in immediately. Melissa saw it and stopped speaking mid-sentence. Not because she didn't have words, but because her words no longer had exclusive access to interpretation. A man near the back said, "That looks official." Another voice followed, "Is that from the county engineer?" Robert didn't answer them. He didn't need to. The document did. Melissa stepped closer to the table, eyes locked on the paper now. Her confidence didn't disappear, but it fractured. "This was not communicated to the HOA board," she said. Robert nodded once. "It wasn't yours to approve." That sentence landed differently than the others, because now it wasn't about disagreement. It was about jurisdiction. The shoreline shifted again, slightly lower, enough that the exposed bank widened into something visible to everyone at once. That's when the celebration fully stopped. No more music, no more announcements, no more forced narrative. Just people watching a lake behave in a way that contradicted the story they had been told. A vendor began packing equipment near the dock without being asked. A few families stepped back toward the parking area. Phones were still recording, but no one was smiling anymore. Melissa looked out over the crowd and realized something that wasn't said aloud. They weren't listening to her first anymore. They were waiting for him to finish. Robert Hayes didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the final document back into the folder and let the silence settle into something heavier than noise had ever been. That was when the vehicle pulled in. A county-issued truck moved slowly down the gravel access road, tires crunching over the same ground the HOA had tried to redefine earlier that day. The presence of it changed the atmosphere immediately, not emotionally, structurally. A man stepped out first, wearing a dark jacket with County Water Authority insignia. Behind him, another official followed carrying a sealed case file. No performance, no crowd awareness. Just procedure arriving late to correct a narrative already in motion. Melissa Carter noticed them before anyone else did. Her posture tightened immediately. "Excuse me," she called out, stepping toward them with the microphone still in hand. "This is an active HOA-managed community event." The lead official didn't respond to her directly. He scanned the shoreline first, the lowered waterline, the temporary structures, the banners. The crowd now fully quiet and uncertain. Then he looked at Robert. "You are Robert Hayes?" he asked. Robert nodded once. The official opened his case file. "We've received a formal verification request regarding water rights execution and shoreline jurisdiction." Melissa stepped forward quickly. "There is no authorized county intervention. This is internal HOA governance." That statement hung in the air, but it no longer carried authority. It only carried claim. The official turned slightly toward her. "Mom, HOA governance does not supersede recorded county water rights adjudication." That line shifted the crowd again. This time fully, not whispers, not confusion. Recognition that two systems were no longer aligned. The official removed a document from the case file and held it up. "This property is registered under a private water rights decree filed with the State Hydrology Board." Melissa froze for the first time. Not visibly dramatic, but fully still. Evan Carter stepped back half a step without realizing it. The official continued. "A controlled adjustment was executed under lawful authorization issued to the deed holder. All procedures were logged and verified." A woman in the crowd whispered, "Deed holder?" Another voice followed. "So it's private." The official nodded once. "Yes, the water body is not under community jurisdiction." That sentence didn't escalate. It ended something. Melissa tried to recover quickly. "We have maintained community access policies based on long-standing usage and HOA designation." The official finally turned fully toward her. "You cannot designate what you do not own." The silence after that was absolute. No one spoke immediately. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Robert didn't move. He didn't need to. The confirmation was no longer theoretical. It was now recorded, spoken, witnessed. The official continued. Any HOA amendment attempting to reclassify this water body without county filing is invalid. Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Evan looked at her now, not as support, but as uncertainty. The official closed his file. This event is to be suspended pending formal review of unauthorized representation of private land as community asset. That was the turning point. Not because anyone fought back, because there was nothing left to argue against. One by one, people in the crowd began stepping away from the dock. Not fast, not panicked, just quietly repositioning themselves out of a story that no longer belonged to them. Melissa stood at the center of it, still holding the microphone. But now the device had no audience. She looked at Robert once. "You planned this," she said quietly. Robert met her gaze. "No," he replied. "I documented it." And for the first time since the event began, Melissa Carter had nothing left to say that the room would believe. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative. The kind of silence that happens when an authority structure finishes collapsing but has yet been formally dismissed. People were still standing in place, still looking at the dock, still processing what had just been confirmed in legal language instead of emotional argument. The county official closed his file. "This event is concluded under notice of invalid jurisdictional representation," he said calmly. That sentence did more damage than any confrontation could have. It didn't accuse. It finalized. Melissa Carter lowered the microphone slightly. For the first time, she wasn't performing for the crowd. She was looking at it. And the crowd was no longer responding to her presence the way it had an hour earlier. Evan Carter stepped closer to her, quietly. "We need to leave this," he said. Not as instruction, as survival assessment. Melissa didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on Robert. "You set this up," she said again.
But softer now.
Like she was trying to reattach certainty to a moment that no longer supported it. Robert didn't move toward her. He didn't escalate. He simply returned the folder to his side, as if putting away something that had already done its job. The county official turned toward the crowd. "All HOA-installed structures on this shoreline are subject to removal pending review of unauthorized land use designation." That was the second collapse point. Not emotional, operational. People near the dock began stepping back fully now. Some looked at the banners, still fluttering over ground that no longer felt claimed. Others checked their phones again, but not to record. This time to verify what they thought they had been attending. A man near the front said quietly, "So none of this was legal?" No one answered him, because the answer had already been spoken in a language that overrode interpretation. Melissa finally lowered the microphone completely. The sound system hummed for a moment without purpose, then went quiet, as someone unplugged part of the setup near the table. Robert finally walked toward the dock, but not onto it. He stopped at the edge where the temporary extension met his shoreline. "This was never community property," he said, not to the crowd, but into the space where the narrative had been built. It was always recorded private land. The county official nodded once, confirmed. That single word carried further than any speech. Melissa took one step back from the dock, then another. Not because she was forced, but because the structure she had been standing on no longer matched the legal ground beneath it. Evan followed her without looking back. One by one, the people who had arrived for celebration began leaving without instruction. Chairs were left behind. Signs were not collected. The dock remained, but it no longer had context. Robert stood still as the shoreline cleared. The water was still but lower than it had been at sunrise. The reflection of the banners was broken now, scattered by distance and exposure. The county official approached him once the crowd had thinned. "You'll receive formal documentation confirming full jurisdictional acknowledgement within the week," he said. Robert nodded once. "Understood." The official paused. Most people don't wait this long before asserting their rights. Robert looked out over the lake. Most people don't need to. By the time the last vehicle left the gravel road, the shoreline had returned to what it had been before the event, not physically unchanged, but socially cleared. The banners were gone, the speakers were gone. The dock stood empty, without an audience or authority attached to it. Robert walked back toward his house as the light shifted across the water. The lake reflected nothing but itself again, and for the first time since the morning began, no one was standing on his land who didn't belong there.
One thing is they make clear is that peace on your own land doesn't come from arguing louder than others. It comes from knowing exactly what's yours, having the paper to stand on it, and staying calm long enough for the truth to survive on its own. When people rely on assumption instead of facts, confusion spreads quickly, but clear recourse and steady patience can bring everything back into place without raising a hand or a voice. What happened at the lake wasn't just about a dispute over property. It was a reminder that titles, deeds, and official records still matter, even when others try to replace them with convenience or opinion. And when other systems are challenged, it's often not argued that restore orders, but persistence and documentation. If you ever had a moment where you had to stand your ground on something you know was right, I'd like to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me yes or no if you think most people would handle the situation the same way. And if you find value in stories like this, quiet, proudest, real-world conflicts where people face pressure and still hold steady, consider subscribing. There are more stories coming from places where clan, law, and human pride meet. And I think you want to be part of conservation.